was rehearsing what he planned to say to me in our kitchen with his girlfriend on speakerphone. I was standing in the hallway with a grocery bag in my hand, and I heard his voice before I even got through the door. Calm, measured, like he was running lines before an audition. I recognized the tone immediately. It was the same voice he used in board meetings. The one he used when he'd already decided something and was just performing the process of deciding. "She's going to cry," he said. "That's the first thing. Just let her cry. Don't engage." A pause. Then a woman's voice, one I'd known for 11 years. "And if she brings up the business?" "She doesn't understand the business. That's always been the problem." I didn't move. I stood there with a bag of groceries. There was a rotisserie chicken in there. I remember that specifically. The smell of it, the warmth through the plastic. And I listened to my husband explain exactly how he expected me to fall apart. "She'll say she sacrificed everything. She'll bring up the early years, the apartment in Raleigh, the nights I worked late. She's sentimental. She'll make it about feelings." "What do you do then?" I let her finish. Then I remind her that emotions don't hold up in arbitration. I set the grocery bag down on the floor of the hallway, slowly, so it didn't make a sound. Then I walked back out the front door and sat in my car for 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. Not because I wasn't devastated. I was, in a way that doesn't have a clean name. But because something had just become very clear to me. And clarity has a way of crowding everything else out. He had already decided. He had decided with her, and they had been deciding together for a long time. My name is Nora. I'm 38 years old. I run a mid-sized event production company based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and I built it from a single spreadsheet and a borrowed Canon camera when I was 26. My husband. I'll call him my husband because he still was, technically, at the time all of this happened. His name is Marcus. We met when I was 23 at a conference in Atlanta where I was working as a vendor coordinator and he was giving a talk on startup funding. He was smart and funny, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting thing in the room, which nobody had ever done before. We got married 4 years later. His best friend was a woman named Lissa. They'd known each other since college. I always liked Lissa. She was sharp and funny, and she remembered everybody's birthday, and she used to bring me coffee exactly the way I liked it when we worked late together on the early pitches for the company. I trusted her the way you trust someone who's been in the room with you through the hard parts. I gave her a seat on my board of directors 3 years ago. I gave her 8% equity. I want you to hold on to that number, 8%. The company is called Stellar Field Productions. We do large-scale corporate events, product launches, conferences, the kind of events where a tech company rents out an entire convention center and needs someone to handle everything from the lighting grid to the catering flow to the green room for their keynote speaker. I started it with $11,000 and a pitch deck I made on a free Canva template. By the time I turned 35, we were doing $4.2 million in annual revenue. Marcus had come into the company in year 3 when we were struggling to make payroll, and he offered to put in $300,000 in exchange for 40% ownership. I said yes because I needed the money and because he was my husband and because I believed in us as a team. That was the first mistake, not marrying him. Marrying him was separate. The mistake was blurring the line between the marriage and the business, between love and equity. He did work hard in the beginning. I won't take that from him. He handled investor relations for 2 years, made some introductions that mattered, showed up to the early client meetings and charmed people the way he was good at charming people. But around year 4, when the company started gaining real traction, something shifted. He started talking about repositioning, about taking the company upmarket away from the mid-sized regional clients that were our bread and butter toward larger national accounts that we didn't have the infrastructure to serve. He hired a consultant, a friend of his, which should have been a flag, who recommended a full rebrand. He started going to meetings I wasn't invited to and calling them preliminary. He started using the phrase long-term vision the way people do when they're trying to make you feel like you're too small to see what they see. And Lissa started agreeing with everything he said. I noticed that. I filed it away, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The thing about finding out your husband and your best friend are having an affair is that the affair is almost secondary. What I mean is, the affair was devastating, yes, in the way that any profound betrayal is devastating, the way it rewrites every memory you touch. But what was underneath the affair was more calculated than that. What I was really dealing with was a coordinated attempt to remove me from my own company. Here's what I pieced together over several weeks of very quiet research. Marcus had been laying groundwork for over a year. He'd been meeting separately with two of our major investors, a private equity firm out of Raleigh called Harwick Capital and a family office in Charleston, and presenting them with an optimized company structure that did not include me in an operational role. He'd been telling them that I was risk-averse, too attached to our existing client base, not scalable. He'd been doing this with Lys's help, using her board seat to lend the proposal institutional credibility. The plan, as near as I could reconstruct it, was this. Marcus would file for divorce, triggering a shareholder dispute. In the chaos of that process, he and Lyssa would present investors with the restructuring proposal, argue that I needed to be bought out at a lowball valuation, and assume majority operational control. Lyssa's 8%, combined with Marcus's 40, gave them 48. They needed to peel away one or two of the remaining shareholders to get to a majority. They had almost done it. What they hadn't counted on was that I had a prenuptial agreement. I know what people think about prenups. I know the connotations, that it means you went into the marriage already planning an exit, or that it's a sign of distrust. Marcus had thought that too when my attorney first raised it. He'd been hurt a little. I'd had to talk him through it. But the prenup wasn't about distrust. It was about clarity. My attorney, a woman named Patricia, who I've worked with since the company's first year, had insisted on a provision that was specific and non-negotiable: Stellar Field Productions, including all shares, IP, client contracts, and operational assets that existed prior to and during the marriage, would remain classified as my sole separate property. Marcus's equity stake was contractually defined as a loan converted to equity arrangement, revocable under specific conditions. One of those conditions was this: any shareholder action taken without the knowledge or written consent of the founding member, me, that materially affected the company's governance structure would constitute a breach, and in the event of a breach, I had the right to exercise a buyback clause at the original investment valuation, indexed to inflation. $300,000 in 2018, plus inflation adjustment. Not $1.8 million, not $2 million, not whatever the company was worth now, the original amount. Marcus did not remember the specific language of that clause. I know he didn't because Patricia and I had reviewed it 6 months earlier when I first started noticing things, and she had said to me, very calmly, "Nora, he has already triggered this provision. We just need the documentation." We spent 4 months building that documentation. I need to tell you about Patricia because she matters to this story. Patricia Wheatley has been a corporate and family law attorney in Charlotte for 22 years. She is 61 years old. She drinks black coffee. She wears reading glasses on a chain around her neck. And she has the energy of someone who has seen every version of the story before and finds each new iteration morally bracing rather than exhausting. She is not warm exactly, but she is absolutely on your side, and those two things are sometimes more important than warmth. When I came to her in December, 2 months before the hallway moment, and told her what I suspected, she didn't ask me if I was sure. She asked me to tell her everything I knew, and then she asked me what documentation I had access to, and then she said, "Let's talk about what we're going to need." We pulled emails from the shared company server, which I still had full administrative access to. We obtained records of investor communications through my own standing in the company. We had a forensic accountant review 3 years of financials, which turned up something neither of us had expected. Marcus had been routing a small percentage of Stellar Field's revenue through a management consulting LLC he had set up in Delaware under a slightly different name. The amounts weren't huge, never more than $14,000 or $15,000 in a single quarter, but the pattern was consistent, and the legal term for it was embezzlement. Patricia said we could file charges. I said, not yet. She looked at me over her reading glasses. I said, I want him to make his move first. I watched him prepare. I watched him the way you watch someone when you know exactly what they're planning and they have no idea you know. I went to dinner with Lessa twice during this period, and she ordered the salmon both times and laughed at my jokes and asked about my mother's health, and I smiled and asked about her sister's new baby. And the whole time I was thinking about the emails. I was thinking about the paper trail. I was thinking about the buyback clause and the Delaware LLC and the 78 pages of documentation that Patricia had couriered to my home office 3 weeks earlier. Marcus announced the dinner meeting on a Tuesday. He said he'd made a reservation at Brevard Room, our restaurant, the place we went for anniversaries, and that he wanted to talk about some company decisions and it would be good to get out of the house. He was careful not to say too much. He was performing normal. I said that sounded nice. I did not tell him that Patricia would be meeting me in the parking garage at 6:45, 45 minutes before the reservation. I did not tell him that I was carrying a sealed envelope in my bag. I did not tell him that the envelope contained a formal notice of buyback clause invocation, a certified copy of the prenuptial agreement, a summary of the forensic accounting findings, a cease and desist regarding shareholder communications with Harwick Capital and the Charleston family office, and, because Patricia had insisted on it, a copy of the evidence we'd compiled regarding the Delaware LLC, which I could choose to use as leverage for a clean separation or hand to the DA's office, depending on how the evening went. Patricia had also arranged for a notary to witness the serving of the document if needed. She was parked 2 spots over from me in the garage. I sat in my car for a few minutes before I went in. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I had worn the blue dress, the one Marcus always said made me look capable. I thought about the night we opened the Stellarfield office on Tryon Street, how we'd ordered Thai food and eaten it on the floor because we didn't have furniture yet, and how he'd said, "This is the beginning of something, Nora," and I had believed him completely. I still believe that. I just understood now that he'd meant something different by it than I had. He was already at the table when I arrived. He had ordered wine, a bottle, which meant he was planning a long evening, which meant he'd rehearsed this the way I knew he had. He looked good. That was the thing about Marcus. He always looked good when he was about to do something difficult. Some people tighten up under pressure. He softened. It was disarming. I think that's why it had worked for so long. "You look great," he said. "Thank you." I sat down. I put my bag on the chair beside me. I ordered sparkling water. He talked for a while. I let him. He talked about the company, about how proud he was of what we'd built together, about the early days in Raleigh, about the first major contract we'd landed, a pharmaceutical conference in Greensboro that had paid $85,000 and felt like $1 million. He was being sentimental, which surprised me because he had specifically told Lissa on the phone that I was the sentimental one. I wondered if this was a different version of the script, tailored to me, or if he didn't know himself well enough to see what he was doing. Then he said, "Nora, I think we both know that things have changed between us. And I think the kindest thing we can do for each other, for the company, is to acknowledge that and figure out a path forward." I nodded. "I've been talking to some of the investors," he said, "and I think there's a structure that works for everyone. I'd have operational control. You'd receive a buyout. A fair one. I want to be clear about that. We're not talking about anything adversarial. And you'd still retain a small equity stake so you benefit from the growth. This is me trying to do right by you, Nora." He looked at me with great sincerity. He had beautiful eyes. That had always been the thing. I reached into my bag. I slid the envelope across the table. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. The sincerity was still on his face, but something underneath it had changed. The way a screen flickers before it goes dark. "What is this?" "You should read it," I said. "I'll wait." He opened it slowly. I watched his eyes move across the first page, the prenup summary, and then stop. He turned to the second page. His jaw tightened. He went to the third page, the forensic accounting summary, and that's when his face did the thing I had been waiting to see. Not anger, not shock, but a very specific kind of stillness that only happens when someone realizes they have massively miscalculated. He looked up at me. Nora. The buyback is at original valuation, I said. That's $318,000, accounting for the inflation index. The breach triggering the clause is documented on pages 4 through 9. Patricia Wheatley filed the formal notice this afternoon. You'll receive a separate copy at the house. You're not serious. The Delaware LLC is documented on pages 11 through 14, I said. We haven't decided yet whether to forward that portion to the DA's office. That's going to depend on how the next few weeks go. He set the papers down. He looked at the wine. He didn't pick it up. Lisa, he started, has already been notified that her board seat is under review pending the shareholder breach investigation, I said. She'll receive formal communication tomorrow. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Around us, the restaurant was full. Soft lighting, the sound of other conversations, someone laughing at a table by the window. Nobody knew. That had always been the thing about the way real power moved. It almost never looked like the movies. It was a woman in a blue dress, sitting across from her husband at their anniversary restaurant, speaking in a level voice and watching him understand. You've been planning this, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was more like he was trying to locate himself in a map that had just been redrawn. You announced a restructuring to Harwood Capital in October, I said, without my knowledge or consent. That was when the clause was triggered. I've had 4 months. He looked at the envelope again, like it might be different if he looked at it a second time. It wasn't. I won't tell you it was easy after that. I won't dress it up. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from the end of something you built with your whole life, and it doesn't matter how clearly you can see the other person's fault. The grief is still there, quiet and total in the morning when you wake up and the house is too still. Marcus's attorney contacted Patricia 2 days later. There was some initial posturing. There always is. But the prenup language was airtight and the buyback clause was unambiguous. He had triggered it. He knew it. Within 3 weeks, his attorney was asking about a timeline for the buyback payment. We settled at $322,000. He signed over his 40%. I had the paperwork filed with the state within the week. The Delaware LLC was a separate matter. Patricia and I discussed it at length. In the end, I made a decision. I would not be filing a complaint with the DA's office, provided that Marcus signed a comprehensive non-disparagement agreement, returned all proprietary company materials, and had no further contact with Stellarfield's investor relationships. He agreed to all of it. I won't pretend that was purely generous. Part of me knows that a quiet resolution protected both of us, but part of me also just didn't want to spend the next 2 years in a courtroom. I had a company to run. Lisa's board seat was terminated at our next formal board meeting. She sent me a text the night before that said, "I'm sorry, Nora, for what it's worth." I read it 3 times. I didn't respond. I've thought about that a lot since then. Whether silence was the right thing, whether I owed her a harder conversation. I still don't have an answer. 11 years is a long time. That was 14 months ago. Stellarfield finished last fiscal year at $5.1 million in revenue. We added 4 new corporate clients, including a 3-year retainer with a financial services firm headquartered in Atlanta. I hired a new head of investor relations, a woman who came to us from a production house in Nashville, and who is, I have come to understand, significantly more competent than the person who held that role before her. I also, eventually, told my mother what had happened. I'd been putting it off for months, because my mother is a woman who has very strong opinions about marriage, and I wasn't sure I had the bandwidth for them. When I finally sat down with her, she was quiet for a long moment after I finished talking. Then she said, "You know your grandmother would have just set the papers on fire." I laughed for the first time in a long time, a real laugh, not a polite one. "I thought about it," I said. "But you were smarter." "Patricia was smarter," I said. "I just paid attention." She reached over and put her hand on mine. "That's the same thing," she said. "People sometimes ask me what I would tell someone who was in the position I was in, who suspected something was happening, who didn't know what to do, and I always say the same thing. Don't react. Document. Find someone who's been in the room with this before and understand that the moment you go quiet is not the moment you give up. It's the moment you get serious. Marcus thought my silence meant I was processing. He thought I was somewhere in the grief stages, denial, anger, whatever came next. He thought my calm was passivity. He had confused stillness with surrender. That was his mistake, and it was the same mistake he'd been making for years. And I think some part of him knew it even then. Sitting at that table with the envelope in front of him, the restaurant full of people who had no idea. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I went home. I think about the rotisserie chicken a lot. That detail sounds almost funny when I say it out loud, but it's the thing I keep coming back to. Standing in that hallway, bag in hand, the smell of something warm, listening to my husband calmly explain how I would fall apart. There's a version of that moment where I drop the bag and say something, where I react the way he expected me to, where the story ends the way he'd planned it. I didn't do that, not because I'm particularly composed by nature, I'm not, but because something in me understood, in that exact moment, that the way I responded in the next few seconds would determine everything that followed. What Marcus and Lissa got wrong wasn't the strategy. The strategy was actually well thought out. What they got wrong was the assumption underneath it, that I was not paying attention, that I had never been paying attention, that the person who built Stellarfield from an $11,000 idea and a free Canva template would somehow not notice when that thing she built was being quietly dismantled around her. That assumption came from a particular kind of blindness, the kind that grows when someone has watched you work hard for years and decided that your hardness was just stubbornness, your loyalty just sentiment, your silence just the absence of thought. Marcus had mistaken my trust for naivety for so long that he had stopped accounting for the possibility that it wasn't. There's something I've learned about integrity that I couldn't have articulated before all of this. It's not about being morally perfect. It's about being honest with yourself about what's actually happening. I stayed honest. I kept looking at the evidence even when I didn't want to see it. I didn't let my love for Marcus or my 11 years of friendship with Lissa talk me out of what I was watching unfold. That's harder than it sounds. It is genuinely painful to stay clear-eyed when the truth is something you would rather not know. But that clarity, that commitment to not lying to yourself, is what makes everything else possible. Without it, you cannot plan. Without it, you cannot act. The 4 months I spent building documentation with Patricia were not glamorous. They were tedious and precise and emotionally exhausting in the way that sustained concentration always is. But that's what real intelligence looks like in practice. Not a moment of sudden brilliance, but the slow, patient work of understanding a situation fully before you move. Marcus had made his move too early, before all his pieces were in position. I waited until mine were. And the part I'm most proud of, the part I hope means something to whoever is listening to this, is that I got back up. Not loudly, not dramatically. I went home that night, I made tea, I called my mother eventually, and then I went back to work. The company needed me. My team needed me. And I am someone who shows up for the things I've built, even when it costs something. Especially when it costs something. What happened to Marcus and Lissa was not luck, and it wasn't fate. It was the direct consequence of choices they made and preparations I made. Actions produce outcomes. The way you treat the people who trusted you will eventually become the terms on which you are judged. They counted on me being passive. I wasn't. That's the whole story.